A wealthy father with one son is cast out in the cold rain of misunderstanding. Days later, a heartbreaking drawing forces those who cast him out to bow their heads and earns the respect of the entire city. Julian Croft felt the familiar weight of the city settle on his shoulders, a bespoke suit of glass and steel he hadn't worn in 14 months. He had left a titan of finance, a man who moved markets with a whisper. He returned a ghost, haunting the edges of a life he no longer recognized as his own. The chauffeured sedan, silent as a tomb, slid to a stop before the towering limestone facade of his own home. It looked less like a house and more like a mausoleum, cold and imposing under the bruised twilight sky. He had bought it for Clara, for the light she brought into every room, a light that had been extinguished 2 years ago on a rain-slicked highway. Now it was just a building. As he stepped out, the first detail of the quiet wrongness struck him. The meticulously manicured rose bushes Clara had loved, the ones that exploded in a riot of crimson and white every summer, were gone, replaced by severe, architectural boxwoods. It was a small thing, a triviality of landscaping, but it felt like an erasure. The second, more jarring detail came the moment the heavy oak door swung open. His son, Leo, stood in the cavernous foyer, a small, perfect soldier in a crisp white shirt and gray flannel trousers. But the boy didn't run to him, didn't shout, "Dad!" with the uninhibited joy Julian's memory ached for. Leo simply stood there, his small hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on a point just past Julian's left shoulder. And on the back of the boy's right hand, stark against his pale skin, was a patch of raw, reddened flesh, an angry welt that looked less like a scrape and more like a chemical burn. "Julian, you're here!" Catherine's voice, a melody of practiced warmth, sliced through the sterile silence. She swept into the foyer, Clara's younger sister, a woman who had stepped into the void Clara left with an unnerving, seamless efficiency. She was beautiful, poised, her blonde hair pulled into a chignon so tight it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow. Leo, look who it is." Leo's gaze flickered to Julian's face for a brief, unreadable second before returning to the wall. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Julian's heart, already a leaden thing in his chest, sank further. He crouched down, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Hey, buddy. I came early. For the big day. Happy birthday." He reached out, his fingers tracing the air just above the angry mark on his son's hand. "What happened here?" Catherine was there in an instant, a silken barrier. "Oh, that," she said with a light, dismissive laugh. "Our little man is becoming so terribly clumsy. He spilled some hot cocoa on himself this morning. Didn't you, darling?" Made a dreadful mess. She smoothed Leo's hair, a proprietary gesture that made Julian's teeth ache. Leo flinched, a microscopic tremor that shot through his small frame and straight into Julian's gut. "He's just a bit overwhelmed. It's been a big day." Julian stood up slowly, the smile gone from his face. He looked from Catherine's perfectly composed expression to his son's terrifyingly blank one. The air in the house was cold, still, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else, something metallic and antiseptic. He had been gone for over a year, closing the most complex merger of his career. A self-imposed exile he told himself was necessary to secure Leo's future after Clara's death. He had convinced himself that leaving Leo in the familiar care of his aunt, in his own home, was the most stable, loving thing he could do. He had been a fool. The house was no longer a home. It was a museum exhibit titled The Perfect Life, and his son, his vibrant, messy, laughing little boy, had become one of the displays. Julian looked at the boxwoods outside, at the sterile gleam of the marble floor, at the raw mark on his son's hand, and he understood. He had not returned to a homecoming. He had walked into a war zone, and his son was the only casualty. The weight on his shoulders shifted, the grief and exhaustion of his long absence crystallizing into something cold, hard, and ferociously protective. His past failure, the decision to leave, was a debt he now had to repay, and the first payment was due. He looked at Catherine, her smile unwavering, and met her gaze. He had no evidence, no proof, only the primal, undeniable instinct of a father. But it was enough. The hunt had begun. The sprawling interior of the house was a testament to Catherine's vision, a place Julian had once paid for, but now felt like an intruder in. Every surface gleamed. The rich, dark wood of the floors he and Clara had chosen for its warmth was now polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the cold, recessed lighting from above. The comfortable, slightly overstuffed furniture they had picked out together had been replaced by stark, minimalist pieces that looked beautiful but offered no comfort, arranged with geometric precision. There were no stray toys, no scattered books, no fingerprints on the glass-topped tables. It was as if the very concept of a child's joyful chaos had been systematically scrubbed from every room. Julian walked through the living room, his hand trailing over the back of a leather couch that felt cold to the touch. He remembered this room filled with the scent of Clara's baking and the sound of Leo's cartoons. He remembered building forts out of cushions, a mess that Clara would laugh about and help them tidy up later, their hands touching as they folded blankets. Now, the silence was so profound it had a physical presence. On the mantelpiece, where a dozen mismatched frames holding candid photos of their family had once stood, there was now a single, large, professionally shot portrait. It showed Catherine and Leo. Catherine was radiant, her arm draped protectively around Leo's shoulders. Leo was smiling, but it was a hostage's smile, a strained arrangement of muscles that didn't reach his eyes. Julian's own photos with Clara and Leo were gone, relegated, he would later discover, to a box in the attic. The erasure was more complete than he had imagined. This wasn't just redecorating. It was a coup. Catherine had not just moved in. She had colonized his life, rewriting its history, erasing his and Clara's presence until only she remained as the central figure in Leo's world. This cold, hard realization settled in his chest, a block of ice that numbed the initial shock and replaced it with a slow-burning, controlled rage. He had allowed this to happen. His grief, his absorption in his work, had been a dereliction of his most fundamental duty. He had left a lamb in the care of a wolf dressed in cashmere. The birthday party was not for a 7-year-old boy. It was for Catherine. There were no brightly colored balloons, no screaming children high on sugar, no magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. Instead, the vast dining room was set for 12, with Catherine's friends, men and women who looked as polished and expensive as the silverware, making polite, muted conversation. The air hummed with the low thrum of adult chatter about stock portfolios and upcoming charity galas. Leo sat at the head of the table, beside Catherine, a miniature king presiding over a court that ignored him. He wore a tiny blazer, his hair slicked back. He sat unnaturally still, his back ramrod straight, his hands placed neatly on his lap beneath the table. Julian sat opposite them, a silent observer at his own son's birthday dinner. He watched as the first course was served, a delicate, artfully arranged salad. Leo picked up his fork with painstaking care, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were defusing a bomb. He took a tiny bite of lettuce, chewed it methodically, and swallowed. His eyes kept darting towards Catherine, checking for approval. Julian's stomach twisted. This wasn't a child eating. This was a performance. It was a terrifying display of compliance. Leo is doing so wonderfully at the Briarwood Academy, Catherine announced to the table, her voice dripping with pride. His penmanship is already impeccable. The headmistress says she's never seen such a neat and orderly boy. A woman with a severe haircut and diamond earrings nodded approvingly. Discipline is so important. It's the foundation of a successful life. You're doing a marvelous job with him, Catherine. It can't be easy, under the circumstances. The veiled reference to Clara's death and Julian's absence hung in the air. Julian felt a dozen pairs of eyes slide towards him, filled with a mixture of pity and judgment. He ignored them, his focus locked on his son. He remembered Leo's old kindergarten art projects, a glorious mess of finger paint and glitter. He remembered Leo trying to write his own name, the letters big and wobbly, a proud, chaotic scrawl. Impeccable penmanship. Orderly. The words felt like insults. Julian tried to breach the wall. "Leo," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the controlled environment. "Do you remember that model galleon we were building? The one with all the tiny ropes? I brought the last few pieces with me. We could finish it this weekend." Leo's eyes lit up for a fraction of a second. A ghost of the boy he used to be flickered across his face. "The sea serpent?" he whispered, the name they'd given it. Before Julian could answer, Catherine placed a hand on Leo's arm. "Oh, Julian, that's sweet of you, but we've cleared all that clutter out." Leo's moved on to more structured hobbies now. Chess, for instance. "It's so much better for developing strategic thinking." She smiled at Julian. A perfect, plastic smile that didn't hide the steel in her eyes. The message was clear: your time is over. His world is mine now. The light in Leo's eyes died. He lowered his gaze back to his plate, his shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. He didn't say another word. Later, as the guests were leaving, Julian found a moment. Catherine was occupied, accepting praise for the flawless evening. He knelt beside Leo, who was standing near the grand piano, a solitary figure in the vast room. Julian pulled a small, wrapped box from his jacket pocket. "I know it's not much, but happy birthday, son." Leo took the box with hesitant fingers. He didn't tear it open. He carefully picked at the tape, peeling it back slowly, and slid the paper off, folding it into a neat square. Inside was a simple, beautifully crafted wooden compass. Julian remembered telling Leo stories of explorers and adventurers, of finding your way when you were lost. "So you'll always know which way is home," Julian said softly. Leo stared at the compass in his palm. He didn't look at Julian. His thumb stroked the smooth wood. Then, he heard Catherine's approaching footsteps. In a flash, Leo shoved the compass deep into his trouser pocket, his body tensing as if he'd been caught with contraband. "Time for bed, darling," Catherine cooed, her hand landing on Leo's shoulder. "Thank you for being such a perfect gentleman tonight. Auntie is so proud of you." Leo allowed himself to be led away without a backward glance. Julian stood alone in the silent, cavernous room, the neatly folded wrapping paper on the floor the only evidence of the aborted moment of connection. The contrast between this cold, controlled boy and the memory of his son was a physical pain. He closed his eyes, and a vivid image flooded his mind, a memory from 3 summers ago. The sun was hot on his skin, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and blooming roses. Clara was laughing, a sound like wind chimes, as she chased a 4-year-old Leo across the lawn. Leo, shirtless and covered in grass stains, shrieked with delight, his face smeared with chocolate ice cream. He was a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated joy. He'd tripped and fallen, scraping his knee, and had run to Julian, crying. Julian had picked him up, held him tight, and kissed the scrape. Clara had come over, wiping his tears with her thumb, telling him he was her brave little adventurer. They were a trinity of warmth, love, and happy messes. He opened his eyes. The memory faded, leaving the cold, silent reality of the dining room in its place. The boy who had just been led up to bed was a stranger, a prisoner. The need to understand what had happened, what was happening, was no longer just a suspicion. It was an imperative, a sacred duty to the laughing, grass-stained boy in his memory. He had to find that boy again, no matter what it took. He had to burn this perfect, sterile world to the ground to do it. The next morning, Julian woke to the oppressive silence of the house. Dawn cast long, gray shadows across the guest room, a chamber as impersonal as a high-end hotel suite. He had slept in fits, his mind replaying the previous night's dinner, Leo's flinch, the empty look in his son's eyes. He knew he couldn't confront Catherine directly. She was too polished, too prepared. Her story about the hot cocoa was plausible enough to deflect a direct accusation. He needed more than a gut feeling. He needed evidence, a crack in the pristine facade she had built around herself and his son. He needed an ally. He dressed and went downstairs, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick runners that carpeted the hallways. He found Catherine in the gleaming white kitchen, sipping tea and scrolling through something on a tablet. She looked up, her smile as bright and artificial as the morning light reflecting off the chrome appliances. "Good morning, Julian. Sleep well? I've had breakfast set out for you in the sunroom." "I'm just going for a walk," he said, his tone clipped. "Need to clear my head. Jet lag." Her smile didn't falter. "Of course. Take your time. Leo has his piano lesson in an hour, and then we have a fitting for his new school blazer. It's a busy day." She was subtly reinforcing her control, her complete ownership of Leo's schedule. Julian nodded and let himself out the back door, into the cool morning air. He didn't walk towards the front gate. Instead, he followed a stone path that wound through the now sterile garden, leading to a small, almost hidden gate in the high hedge that separated his property from the one next door. He slipped through it, his heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. Next door lived Eleanor Gable, a widow in her late 70s who had lived in her charming, ivy-covered cottage for over 50 years. She had been a surrogate grandmother to Leo, sneaking him cookies over the fence and letting him help water her chaotic, colorful flower beds. She had adored Clara. Julian prayed she hadn't been charmed by Catherine. He found her on her knees in her garden, tending to a patch of defiant, bright orange marigolds. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes, clouded with age, widening in surprise. "Julian? My goodness, boy. I heard you were back." She got to her feet slowly, brushing dirt from her trousers. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice softer than it had been in days. "It's good to see you." "Is it?" she asked, her gaze sharp and penetrating. She looked past him, towards the imposing stone wall of his house. "Things have changed over there. This was the opening he needed." "I know. That's why I'm here. I'm worried about Leo." Mrs. Gable's face, a roadmap of wrinkles, tightened with a sorrowful anxiety. She wrung her hands, her dirt-caked fingers twisting a gardening trowel. "I don't want to cause trouble, Julian. Catherine. She's very particular." "Please," Julian urged, stepping closer. "Tell me what you've seen. Anything." She hesitated, her gaze darting back towards the mansion as if Catherine could hear them even from this distance. "It's not one big thing," she began, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's 1,000 little things. After you left, after dear Clara passed." The laughter just stopped. "That's the best way I can describe it." The house went quiet. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I used to hear Leo playing in the yard, shouting, being a boy. Now, nothing. I see him sometimes through the hedge. He just walks. Or sits. He never runs." Julian's throat felt tight. "What else?" "The sounds," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Late at night sometimes. I'm a light sleeper. Here, scrubbing. A harsh, frantic sound. From the upstairs bathroom, the big one. The window faces my bedroom. Sometimes it goes on for an hour. Scrub, scrub, scrub. It's a dreadful, angry sound. Scrubbing." The word landed like a stone in Julian's gut. He thought of the raw, red mark on Leo's hand. Not a burn from cocoa. A scrub mark. A mark from being obsessively, violently cleaned. The image was so monstrous his mind recoiled. "And he doesn't come for cookies anymore," Mrs. Gable added, her voice thick with emotion. "In the beginning, he used to sneak over. He looked hungry. Not for food, but for a bit of kindness. He'd sit right here on these steps and just be quiet. Then one day, Catherine must have found out. He came to the gate and he wouldn't come in. He just looked at me, and he said, 'Auntie says your garden is dirty.' I'm not allowed to get dirty." He had tears in his eyes, Julian. He looked terrified. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of psychological torment so cruel and insidious it took Julian's breath away. It wasn't about discipline. It was about filth. About a pathological obsession with cleanliness, with purity. Catherine wasn't just controlling Leo. She was trying to scour him clean of his very essence, of his boyhood, of his connection to his past, to Clara, to Julian. He thanked Mrs. Gable, his mind racing. He promised her he would handle it, that she wouldn't be brought into it. As he walked back towards his own house, the quiet wrongness now had a name. It was abuse. Not of the fist, but of the mind and the spirit, and, apparently, of the brush. Back inside, he knew he had to search Leo's room. He waited until he heard the telltale sound of the piano. Stilted, precise notes with no soul, and Catherine's voice correcting a supposed error. He slipped up the stairs. Leo's room was as sterile as the rest of the house. The bed was made with military precision. The toys, what few remained, were arranged on a shelf, untouched, like museum pieces. There were no posters on the wall, no drawings taped to the wardrobe. It was the room of a ghost child. Julian's heart ached. He began his search, trying to be as methodical and silent as possible. He looked under the bed, in the closet, between the pages of the few, pristine books on the nightstand. Nothing. He was about to give up when his hand brushed against a loose corner of the fitted sheet at the head of the bed. He lifted the mattress slightly. Tucked between the mattress and the box spring was a small, folded piece of drawing paper. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling. He unfolded it. The drawing was simple, rendered in a child's unsteady hand. It depicted a small, stick-figure boy standing in a bathtub. The boy had no face, just a round, empty circle. He was holding a teddy bear, its button eyes wide. All around the boy, the water wasn't blue. It was a furious scribble of red and black crayon, a vortex of violence. And descending into the tub from the top of the page was a large, dark shape with bristles. A brush. Julian stared at the drawing, the paper shaking in his hand. It was a confession, a cry for help from a boy who had no words left. The faceless child, the angry, violent water, the menacing brush. It was all there. Mrs. Gable's testimony, the mark on Leo's hand, and now this. This was the first piece of tangible proof. He carefully folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He now had a map to the heart of the darkness, and he would follow it, no matter how deep he had to go. He had to test Catherine one more time. He went downstairs and waited for the piano lesson to end. When Catherine emerged, he held up a placid, neutral expression. "I was just thinking," he said casually. "I haven't seen Leo draw in a while. He used to love it. Maybe I could get him a new set of art supplies for his birthday." Catherine's smile became a fraction too tight. "Oh, that's not necessary. We're focusing on less messy pursuits. Art just encourages clutter and disorder. He doesn't have time for it anyway, with his tutoring and his lessons. He's much happier with a structured routine." The lie was so smooth, so practiced. But Julian could see it now, the flicker of something cold and controlling behind her eyes. He had his validation. The war had moved from suspicion to certainty. The drawing was a key, but Julian needed to find the lock it belonged to. He needed to find the instrument of Catherine's cruelty. The thought of what it might be made his blood run cold, but he pushed the emotion down, compartmentalizing it the way he would during a hostile takeover negotiation. Emotion was a liability. Strategy was everything. He needed to get into Catherine's private space, the master suite, the room that had once been his and Clara's. He waited until the next afternoon. He knew Catherine had a standing appointment with her personal trainer at 3 p.m. He watched from the upstairs window as her sleek black car pulled out of the driveway. The house fell into its customary silence. Leo was with a tutor in the library, a new addition to his suffocating schedule. Julian had a small window of opportunity. 45 minutes, max. His heart hammered against his ribs as he walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. The door was closed. He hesitated for a second, his hand on the cold brass knob. This felt like a desecration. He was breaking into a room that held the last vestiges of his life with Clara, a room now occupied by the woman who was systematically destroying their son. He took a breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The scent hit him first, not Clara's lavender and vanilla, but the same sharp, antiseptic lemon smell that permeated the rest of the house, only stronger here. The room was unrecognizable. The warm colors were gone, replaced with shades of gray, white, and chrome. It was cold, elegant, and utterly soulless. A large, abstract painting that looked like a sterile void hung over the bed where a wedding portrait of him and Clara used to be. He forced himself to move, to focus. Where would she keep it? He started with the obvious places. The closet was immense, a walk-in space filled with designer clothes, all organized by color, each hanger precisely spaced. Nothing. He checked the drawers of her vanity. Makeup, perfume, jewelry, all meticulously arranged. Nothing. He moved to the bedside tables. One held a book on minimalist architecture, the other a single glass of water on a coaster. He was wasting time. He had to think like her. This wasn't something she would be proud of, but it was part of her ritual, her obsession. It would be somewhere private, somewhere related to cleaning. The bathroom. The door to the ensuite bathroom was ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a sanctuary of white marble and gleaming chrome. A vast, spa-like space with a freestanding tub and a glass-walled shower. It was pristine. Not a single drop of water marred the fixtures. Not a single item was out of place on the wide vanity. It was the bathroom of someone who didn't live, but who curated an existence. He felt a surge of revulsion. This was the room from Leo's drawing. The tub. His eyes were drawn to it, a gleaming white sarcophagus. He imagined his son, small and terrified, in that tub, the water filled with red scribbles. He shook his head, forcing the image away. Focus. He opened the mirrored cabinets above the sink. Expensive skin creams, serums, dental hygiene products, all in perfect order. He crouched down and opened the large cabinet under the sink. The front was lined with neatly folded, fluffy white towels. Behind them, he saw a collection of designer cleaning products, their labels all facing forward. It was a shrine to sanitation. He began to pull them out one by one. Organic glass cleaner, stone polish, artisanal grout whitener. And then he saw it. Tucked away at the very back, behind a large bottle of floor concentrate, was a simple plastic caddy. It didn't belong with the other expensive products. It was cheap, functional, and ugly. His breath caught in his throat. He reached in and pulled it out. Inside the caddy were 3 brushes. They weren't for cleaning floors or tiles. They were stiff, industrial-grade scrubbing brushes, the kind used for cleaning engine parts or scouring stubborn grime from concrete. The bristles were made of a harsh, unforgiving nylon. One was large for broad surfaces. One was smaller for details. The third was a long, thin brush for getting into crevices. Julian's blood turned to ice. He picked up the smallest brush, the one for details. The bristles were stiff enough to draw blood. He turned it over in his hand, his mind refusing to make the final, horrific connection. Then he saw it. Caught in the dense, white bristles was a faint, brownish-red stain. And tangled within them, almost invisible, was a single, tiny strand of dark, childish hair. The world tilted. The air rushed out of his lungs. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't just psychological. The scrubbing sounds Mrs. Gable heard. The raw patch on Leo's hand. The drawing. Catherine was literally, physically, scrubbing his son. She was scrubbing him as if he were a dirty object, a stained piece of fabric. The hot cocoa spill wasn't a cause. It was a pretext. Any perceived mess, any grass stain, any drop of mud, any sign that Leo was a living, breathing, playing boy, was a stain that had to be violently scoured away. The cruelty of it, the sheer pathological madness of it, was staggering. A wave of pure, black rage washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He wanted to smash the marble vanity, to tear the room apart, to find Catherine, and he clenched his fists, his knuckles white, the brush digging into his palm. He could feel the sharp bristles against his own skin, and he imagined them on his son's tender flesh. And if he lost, Leo would be trapped here forever. With a monumental effort of will, he forced the rage down, packing it into a cold, dense core of purpose in his chest. This was no longer just a rescue mission. This was an extermination. He had to be smarter than her. He had to be more patient. He had to be colder. He carefully placed the brush back in the caddy, slid the caddy back into its hiding place behind the cleaning supplies, and rearranged the towels exactly as they had been. He stood up, his movements stiff, robotic. He took out his phone and, with trembling fingers, took several clear, high-resolution photos of the caddy and its contents in their hiding place. The timestamp on the photos would be his alibi. He walked out of the bathroom, out of the master suite, and closed the door behind him, his face a mask of calm. He had the weapon. He had the motive. He had his son's silent testimony. Now he had to build the perfect trap, one that Catherine, in all her meticulous planning, would never see coming. The soldier in him, the part he thought he'd left behind in boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, was now fully awake. He was operating behind enemy lines, and his objective was absolute. The house was now enemy territory. Every polished surface, every silent corridor, felt charged with menace. Julian moved through it like a ghost, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. Inside, he was a storm of cold fury and meticulous planning. His every interaction with Catherine was a calculated move on a chessboard he was only just beginning to map out. He had to play the part of the slightly disconnected, jet-lagged father, all while gathering the ammunition he would need to blow her world apart. His first move was to secure an outside asset. He couldn't do this alone, and he couldn't risk involving the police yet. Catherine would lawyer up, create a smokescreen of lies, and paint him as an absentee father trying to violently reinsert himself into his son's life. He needed unimpeachable intelligence. He retreated to the guest room, locked the door, and made a call on a secure, encrypted line he used for his most sensitive business dealings. The phone was answered on the first ring. Vance, the voice was gravelly, calm, and gave nothing away. Elias Vance was a man who didn't officially exist, an ex-intelligence operative from a dusty corner of the world. He now ran the most discreet and effective private investigation firm money could buy. He found things that were buried under layers of concrete and legal obfuscation. Julian had used him once before to vet a potential corporate partner, and Elias had uncovered a history of fraud so well hidden it was practically a ghost. Elias, it's Julian Croft. There was a brief pause. Julian, it's been a while. I assume this isn't about the stock market. It's about my son, Julian said, his voice low and tight. He quickly, clinically, laid out the situation. His return, Leo's state, the neighbor's testimony, the drawing, the brushes. He omitted no detail, keeping his tone devoid of emotion. He sent the photos he had taken in the bathroom. Elias was silent for a long moment after Julian finished. When he spoke, the usual professional detachment in his voice was tinged with something else. Cold anger. The sister-in-law's name is Catherine Devereaux. Yes, Clara's younger sister. I need everything you know about her. Parents, education, previous addresses, relationships. Don't filter it. Give me everything. Julian spent the next 20 minutes relaying every piece of information he had, every anecdote Clara had ever told him about her sister. The picture was of a woman who had always lived in Clara's shadow, perpetually striving for a perfection she could never quite achieve. All right, Elias said when he was done. I'll start digging. I'm looking for a precedent, pattern, an origin story for this. Pathology. People like this aren't created in a vacuum. There's always a history, sealed records, juvenile incidents, a traumatic event she's tried to bury. I'll find it. Stay put. Act normal. Don't tip your hand. You get one shot at this, Julian. Don't waste it. The line went dead. Julian felt a sliver of relief. A powerful weapon was now being aimed at Catherine's past. All he had to do was wait for it to fire. But waiting was the hardest part. He was a man of action, and being forced into passivity while his son suffered was a unique form of torture. That afternoon, Catherine announced they were all going to the Museum of Modern Art. It's important for Leo to be exposed to culture, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The trip was an exercise in extreme tension. Julian walked beside Leo, consciously creating a physical buffer between his son and Catherine. The museum was like an extension of the house. Vast, white, silent spaces filled with objects that were meant to be admired but not touched. Catherine would point at a minimalist sculpture, a canvas with a single black line, and offer a sterile interpretation of its meaning. Leo would nod, his face blank, his hands clasped behind his back. Julian watched his son, his heart aching. He tried to engage him, pointing to a vibrant, chaotic painting full of color and movement. "Look at that one, Leo. It looks like a supernova, doesn't it?" Leo glanced at it, then immediately looked at Catherine, as if for permission to have an opinion. Catherine sniffed dismissively. "It's rather messy, don't you think? So undisciplined." The word messy was a dagger. Julian saw Leo physically recoil from the painting, taking a small step back. The conditioning was absolute. Messy was bad. Chaos was bad. Joy was bad. Later, in a quieter gallery, Julian found a moment alone with Leo while Catherine was momentarily distracted by an acquaintance. He knelt down, pulling the wooden compass from his own pocket. "You still have yours?" he whispered. Leo's hand instinctively went to his pocket, a tiny, protective gesture. He gave a single, small nod. "Good," Julian said. "That's your secret. It's just for you. It helps you know you're not lost. Okay? Even when it feels like you are." Leo's eyes, for the first time, seemed to focus on Julian's. There was a flicker of understanding, a deep and desolate sadness that was far too old for a 7-year-old. He didn't speak, but his gaze held Julian's for a solid 3 seconds, a silent exchange of shared desperation. That night was the turning point. The waiting, the forced normalcy, was fraying Julian's nerves to the breaking point. He went to tuck Leo into bed, a ritual Catherine had grudgingly allowed, always standing in the doorway, a silent sentinel. The room was dark, save for a small nightlight casting a pale glow. Leo was already in bed, lying perfectly still, his worn, one-eyed teddy bear, Baron, clutched in his arms. It was the only object from his before life that seemed to have survived Catherine's purge. Julian sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't speak, just rested his hand on the blanket over Leo's small chest, feeling the faint, rhythmic beat of his heart. Catherine shifted in the doorway, a silent reminder of her presence. Julian ignored her. He leaned in close, his voice a barely audible whisper, meant only for his son. "I'm here now, Leo. I'm not leaving again." Leo didn't respond for a long time. Julian thought he might be asleep. But then, in a voice so faint it was like the rustling of a single leaf, Leo whispered back, his lips barely moving. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was staring at the teddy bear clutched in his arms. "Baron gets dirty too," he said. The 5 words hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a cryptic phrase. It was a complete and total confession. It was the key to the entire twisted psychology of his torment. "I get dirty. That's why this happens to me. The bear, my last piece of comfort, my last link to my old life, also gets dirty. It is also at risk." It was a statement of shared guilt, of shared fate with his inanimate friend. He wasn't just being punished for making a mess. He was being punished for being a mess, for being a child. Julian felt a tear slide down his cheek, hot and sharp in the cold room. He squeezed Leo's shoulder gently. He couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too large. He stood up, turned, and walked past Catherine in the doorway without looking at her. The soldier's patience had reached its limit. Now it was time to plan the assault. He had his objective, he had his asset in the field, and he had the final, damning testimony whispered from the mouth of the victim himself. The waiting was over. 2 days later, the call came. Julian was in the sterile home office Catherine had assigned him, staring at stock tickers that seemed to belong to another man's life. His phone vibrated. An unknown number. He answered. "I have it," Elias Vance said without preamble. It was buried deep. Sealed juvenile record. Expunged by a family court judge who owed her father a favor. Julian leaned forward, his entire body rigid with anticipation. What is it? Catherine Devereaux, age 15, Elias began, his voice flat and dispassionate as if reading a grocery list. Hospitalized for 2 weeks at the Northwood Psychiatric Institute. Diagnosis: severe obsessive-compulsive disorder with associated self-harm tendencies. The precipitating incident: her mother threw out a collection of her perfectly organized porcelain dolls because they were gathering dust. Catherine had a complete psychotic break. Julian closed his eyes, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. It gets worse, Elias continued. The intake report from the hospital is the real prize. It includes notes from her therapy sessions. Her mother was a fanatic. The Devereaux household was a place of extreme emotional and psychological abuse centered around cleanliness and order. Any mess, any item out of place, any grade less than an A was treated as a personal failing. A sign of inner filth. The mother would punish Catherine for a smudge on the wall by making her scrub it for hours. She once found a spot of mud on Catherine's shoe and made her bleach her entire collection of shoes, resulting in chemical burns on her hands. Chemical burns. The phrase echoed the raw mark on Leo's hand. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a pattern, a cycle of abuse passed down from one generation to the next. Catherine wasn't just a monster. She was a monster that had been created, forged in a crucible of her own childhood trauma. She wasn't just punishing Leo for being a child. She was punishing the child she had never been allowed to be, projecting her own mother's pathological standards onto him. The boy who looked so much like Clara, the sister who had escaped, the sister who was messy and loved and free. He was the ultimate vessel for her resentment. She's recreating her own trauma, Julian, Elias said, his voice softening slightly. She's not the mother. She is her mother. And your son is her. A wave of something other than pure rage washed over Julian. It was a grim, chilling understanding. It didn't excuse her actions, nothing could, but it explained them. It gave him the final piece of the puzzle, the psychological blueprint of his enemy. He now knew not just what she was doing, but why, and that made her predictable. It made her vulnerable. Thank you, Elias, Julian said, his voice hoarse. Send me everything you have. Encrypted. It's already on its way. What's your move? I'm ending it, Julian said. Today. He hung up the phone, his mind a whirlwind of strategy. He had the past. He had the present. He just needed to force them to collide. He needed Catherine to lose control, to let the mask slip, just for a moment, in a way that was undeniable. And he knew that people under immense pressure make mistakes. All he had to do was apply the right kind of pressure. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. That evening, as they were sitting in the silent, tomb-like living room, Leo, holding the small wooden compass Julian had given him, accidentally let it slip from his fingers. It fell onto the glass coffee table with a soft clatter and then rolled onto the pristine white rug. It was a tiny incident, a nothing, but in Catherine's world, it was a seismic event. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been placidly scanning a magazine, narrowed into slits. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The mask of the perfect caretaker didn't just slip. It shattered. What did you do? She hissed, her voice low and venomous. Leo froze, his face draining of all color. He looked at the compass on the floor as if it were a live grenade. Pick it up, Catherine commanded, her voice trembling with a barely suppressed rage. Leo scrambled to pick it up, his small hands fumbling with fear. As he reached for it, he inadvertently knocked over a tall, slender vase on a nearby end table. It was empty. Catherine didn't allow real flowers because they wilted and made a mess, but it hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, explosive crash, shattering into a dozen large pieces. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Catherine rose to her feet. The poised, elegant woman was gone. In her place was something twisted and ugly. "You clumsy, filthy boy!" she shrieked, the words tearing out of her throat. "Look at this. Look at the mess you've made." She lunged forward and grabbed Leo's arm. her fingers digging into his bicep. Leo cried out, a thin whimper of pain and terror. You are just like her. Catherine spat, her face contorted, spittle flying from her lips. Always making a mess. Always ruining everything perfect. Julian was on his feet in an instant. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and placed his hand firmly on Catherine's wrist. Let him go, Catherine, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. She whirled on him, her eyes blazing with a madness he now fully understood. For a second, she seemed to see her own mother standing there. Her grip on Leo's arm loosened. She looked from Julian's cold, hard face to Leo's terrified one, and a flicker of awareness dawned in her eyes. She realized her mistake. She had lost control. She had shown him who she really was. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her face paling. She tried to reassemble her composure, smoothing her dress, but it was too late. The mask was in pieces on the floor along with the broken vase. He's overwrought, she stammered, trying to reclaim the narrative. He needs to rest. No, Julian said, his voice like ice. He stepped between her and Leo, shielding his son with his body. Leo immediately pressed himself against the back of Julian's legs, his small hands clutching the fabric of his trousers. He needs his father. Julian looked down at the shattered vase, then back at Catherine's panicked face. He had it. He had the moment. He had the witness, himself. And he had the final piece of leverage he needed. He now knew her deepest fear. Not just of mess, but of being seen for who she truly was. The confrontation he was planning would no longer be a gamble. It would be an execution. The next morning, Julian put his plan into motion. He made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer, Arthur Jennings, a shrewd, silver-haired man who had handled the Croft family's legal affairs for 30 years. The second was to Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned child psychologist Julian had been referred to by Elias. He explained the situation to both men in concise, urgent terms. He didn't ask them to come as professionals, not yet. He asked them to come to the house at 11 a.m. under the pretext of discussing the final details of the trust fund he was establishing for Leo. It was a plausible, even expected, reason for their visit. Catherine, obsessed with status and finance, would not be suspicious. He then went to find Leo, who was sitting quietly in the breakfast nook, pushing a piece of toast around his plate. Julian knelt beside him. Leo, he said softly, today some men are coming to visit. We're going to talk, and I might show them your drawing. The one of the boy in the tub. Is that okay? Leo looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, fragile hope. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, Julian continued. Just stay close to me. Can you do that? Another nod. Julian squeezed his shoulder gently. You're very brave. At precisely 11 a.m., the doorbell rang. Catherine, dressed in an impeccable cream-colored dress, swept to the door to greet them. Arthur, Dr. Finch, how lovely to see you, she said, her voice the epitome of gracious hospitality. Julian, your guests are here. Julian led them into the formal living room, the scene of the previous night's explosion. The broken vase was gone, the rug vacuumed, all evidence of the chaos erased. Catherine played the perfect hostess, offering coffee and making small talk. Julian let her, watching as she confidently spun her web of normalcy. He let her believe she was in complete control. He waited until the coffee had been poured and they were all seated. Arthur Jennings, a man who could smell a lie from 100 paces, was watching Catherine with a carefully neutral expression. Dr. Finch observed the dynamic between Catherine and Leo, who had silently taken a seat on the ottoman at Julian's feet, with quiet, professional intensity. Thank you for coming, Julian began, his voice calm and measured. While the trust is important, there's a more pressing matter I wanted to discuss. It's about Leo's well-being. Catherine stiffened. Her smile became brittle. I assure you, Julian, Leo's well-being is my absolute top priority. He is thriving. Is he? Julian asked, his gaze unwavering. I've noticed he seems anxious, particularly around the concept of cleanliness. Catherine let out a light, rehearsed laugh. Boys are messy. I'm simply trying to instill a sense of order and discipline. Surely there's no harm in that. I found this in his room, Julian said, his voice dropping slightly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded drawing. He didn't show it to her. He held it in his hand. It's a drawing he made. It's quite detailed. It shows a little boy in a bathtub. The color drained from Catherine's face. Her knuckles, resting on the arm of her chair, were white. He has an overactive imagination. It's nothing. The water isn't blue, Julian continued, his voice relentless and steady. It's red and black, and there's a brush, a large, stiff brush. He slowly unfolded the drawing and placed it on the coffee table, facing Dr. Finch and Arthur. The two men looked at the drawing. Dr. Finch's professional calm faltered for a second, replaced by a look of profound concern. Arthur's face hardened. Catherine, Julian said, his voice now like steel, I also found some brushes in your bathroom. Industrial-grade scrubbing brushes. The kind you'd use to clean a garage floor. Catherine's breathing became shallow. She stared at the drawing as if it were a serpent. This is absurd. You're twisting things. You've been gone for over a year. You have no idea what he's like. I know what my son is like, Julian countered, his voice rising for the first time, filled with a righteous fury he no longer tried to conceal. And he is not filth that needs to be scoured away. This was the moment. The accusation, the public unveiling of her secret shame. Her carefully constructed world began to buckle. Her eyes darted between the three men, seeing not allies, but judges. Her composure, her greatest weapon, shattered into a million pieces. How dare you? She shrieked, leaping to her feet. Her face, moments before a mask of serene beauty, was now a contorted mask of rage and panic. He is a liar, a dirty, messy, little liar. He does it on purpose to ruin everything, just like she did. She lunged, not at Julian, but at the drawing on the table, her hands like claws, intending to rip it to shreds. It was a primal, instinctual act to destroy the evidence, to destroy the truth. But before she could reach it, something small and momentous happened. Leo, who had been frozen with fear, moved. In a single, decisive motion, he stood up from the ottoman and took one step, then another, placing himself directly behind Julian's legs. He wrapped his small arms around his father's thigh and held on tight. It was a small act, but it was an earthquake. It was a choice, an alignment, an act of defiance against his tormentor. He was no longer a passive victim. He had chosen his protector. Catherine froze, her hand hovering over the table. She saw the boy, her prisoner, clinging to his father. She saw the shocked and horrified faces of Arthur and Dr. Finch. She saw Julian, no longer a ghost from the past, but a solid, immovable wall of paternal fury. And in that instant, she knew she had lost. The truth was out, and it was devouring her whole. Her shriek dissolved into a choked, desperate sob. The facade had not just been shattered. It had been pulverized, and she was left exposed and utterly alone in the ruins. As Catherine's hysterical sobs filled the pristine living room, Arthur Jennings calmly took out his phone. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on Julian, a look of grim understanding passing between them. He made the call he had been instructed to make if the situation escalated as Julian had predicted. It's time, was all he said before hanging up. Within 15 minutes, the quiet, manicured street was filled with the silent, flashing lights of two police cruisers and an unmarked sedan from the Department of Child and Family Services. The arrival was discreet, professional, and utterly final. Two uniformed officers, a plainclothes detective, and a calm, competent-looking social worker named Ms. Albright were met at the door by Arthur. The sight of the authorities on her doorstep tipped Catherine over the edge from hysteria into a state of dissociated babbling. It's a misunderstanding, she kept repeating to no one in particular. her hands twisting the fabric of her expensive dress. "He's an orderly boy. I was just helping him." Dr. Finch spoke to Detective Miller and Ms. Albright in a low, urgent tone, gesturing towards the drawing still on the coffee table and the small boy still clinging to his father's leg. His professional assessment, delivered in the immediate aftermath of Catherine's breakdown, carried immense weight. He spoke of manipulated behavior, psychological coercion, and trauma responses. While one officer spoke with a now catatonic Catherine, Detective Miller, a weary-looking man with kind eyes, knelt down to be on the same level as Julian and Leo. He didn't address Leo directly. He spoke to Julian. "Mr. Croft, Ms. Albright and I are here to ensure your son is safe. We need to ask you some questions, and we may need to search the premises. You have my full cooperation," Julian said, his hand resting protectively on Leo's head. "Search anywhere you like. Start with the master bathroom, under the sink." As Detective Miller and an officer headed upstairs, the doorbell rang again. It was Mrs. Gable from next door. She had seen the police cars and, her face a mixture of fear and resolve, had decided she could no longer remain silent. Miss Albright took her into the dining room, and Julian could hear the elderly woman's trembling voice, finally unburdening itself of the months of worry. She spoke of the silence that had fallen over the house, the frantic, late-night scrubbing sounds, and the terrified look in Leo's eyes when he told her he wasn't allowed in her dirty garden. Her testimony, coming from a third-party witness with no stake in the family drama, was devastatingly powerful. It corroborated everything Julian had suspected. A few minutes later, Detective Miller returned from upstairs. He was holding a clear evidence bag. Inside was the plastic caddy with the 3 scrubbing brushes. He held it up. "We found these, Mr. Croft, exactly where you said they'd be." He looked over at Catherine, who was now slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the wall, her perfect world having completely collapsed in less than an hour. The tangible evidence, combined with Dr. Finch's on-site evaluation and Mrs. Gable's testimony, created an irrefutable cascade of truth. Ms. Albright emerged from the dining room, her face grim. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft but firm, "based on what we've seen and heard today, we are removing Leo from this home, effective immediately. Given the circumstances and your legal standing as his sole surviving parent, we are prepared to release him into your temporary emergency custody, pending a formal hearing." Relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over Julian. He looked down at his son, who was watching the proceedings with wide, unblinking eyes, absorbing the seismic shift in the power dynamic of his world. The monster was being vanquished. The rescuer had arrived. The uniformed officers approached Catherine. One of them spoke to her in a low, formal tone. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." Catherine didn't resist. She seemed to have shrunk, all the brittle pride and arrogance gone, leaving only a hollowed-out shell. As they escorted her out of the living room, her eyes fell on Leo one last time. There was no anger in them, no hatred. There was only a vast, empty confusion. The look of someone who had been following a set of internal rules so rigidly and for so long that she could no longer comprehend a world in which those rules were considered monstrous. Julian watched her go, feeling not triumph, but a profound, weary sadness for the broken woman and a surge of cold fury for the damage she had wrought. The perfect facade had been shattered, and the reckoning was swift and absolute. The authorities moved with methodical efficiency, documenting the scene, taking statements. The machine of justice, once set in motion, was powerful and implacable. The quiet wrongness that had greeted Julian upon his return had been dragged out into the light, and it was more ugly and twisted than he could ever have imagined. But it was over. The immediate threat was neutralized. The house fell silent once more, but this time, it was not the silence of oppression. It was the silence of the aftermath, the quiet before the long, arduous process of healing could begin. The legal formalities took hours. Julian sat in the cold, formal living room, Leo never leaving his side, as Arthur Jennings and Ms. Albright navigated the paperwork for the emergency custody order. The house that had been a prison now felt like a crime scene, its sterile beauty tainted by the ugly truth that had been exposed within its walls. Julian felt an overwhelming urge to get his son out, to leave this place of silent screams and polished surfaces behind forever. Finally, Ms. Albright handed him a signed document. "It's done, Mr. Croft. He's in your care. A family court judge will review the case within 72 hours, but it's a formality. Catherine Devereaux has been placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold, and she's facing multiple felony charges, including child abuse and endangerment. She won't be coming back here." The words were a final, definitive end to the nightmare. Julian nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked down at Leo, who was staring at the official-looking paper in his father's hand. "It's time to go, buddy," Julian said softly. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't take any of the perfectly arranged clothes from Leo's closet or the untouched toys from his shelves. He wanted nothing from this house. He simply scooped Leo up into his arms. The boy, who had been so tense and rigid, finally seemed to relax, melting against his father's chest and burying his face in the crook of Julian's neck. He was surprisingly light, as if the fear had hollowed him out. Julian grabbed one thing on his way out of the room. Baron, the one-eyed teddy bear, who was lying on the floor where he'd been dropped. He tucked the bear under Leo's arm. He carried his son down the grand staircase and through the cavernous foyer for the last time. He didn't look back. He walked out the front door, into the late afternoon sun, and didn't stop until he reached his own rental car. A simple, anonymous sedan parked down the street. He gently strapped a sleeping Leo into the back seat, the boy's small face finally peaceful, his breathing deep and even. The rescue was complete. Instead of going to an airport or another cold, empty house, Julian drove to the city's finest hotel. He booked the presidential suite, a sprawling space with warm lighting, soft carpets, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city lights twinkling to life as dusk fell. It was a world away from the sterile mausoleum they had just fled. The first night in their new, safe environment was a study in small, heartbreaking details. When Julian ordered room service, a feast of everything a 7-year-old could want: pizza, chicken fingers, a mountain of French fries, a giant chocolate milkshake, Leo just stared at it. He didn't reach for anything. He looked at Julian, then at the food, as if waiting for a complex set of instructions. "It's all for you, Leo," Julian said gently. "You can eat whatever you want. You can even eat with your hands." Leo looked at his own hands, clean and pale, and then hesitantly picked up a single French fry. He ate it slowly, then looked at Julian for a reaction. Julian just smiled and picked up a slice of pizza. "It's good, huh?" Slowly, cautiously, Leo began to eat. He didn't gorge himself. He ate with a strange, solemn deliberateness, but he ate. Later, Julian noticed that Leo had taken 2 extra bread rolls from the tray and hidden them in the drawer of the nightstand. The act of hoarding food, a classic sign of prolonged neglect and uncertainty, sent a fresh pang of grief and anger through Julian. That night, Julian didn't sleep in the master bedroom of the suite. He had the hotel staff bring in a comfortable roll-away bed and placed it next to Leo's. In the middle of the night, a small, choked cry woke him. Leo was thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grip of a nightmare. His small fists were clenched, and he was muttering, "No, no, dirty." Julian sat on the edge of Leo's bed, his heart breaking. He didn't wake him. He just rested a hand on his son's back, a steady, warm presence. "I'm here," he whispered into the darkness. "It's okay. You're safe. I've got you." He sat there for over an hour, long after Leo's breathing had returned to a peaceful rhythm. He watched his son sleep, the moonlight tracing the outline of his small, innocent face. The full weight of what had happened, and what lay ahead, settled upon him. The legal battle,